Hi, I'm Cheryl Belson with American Sewing Guild, and I am so happy to be joined for this episode of Fireside Chats by a few members of a group called Sisters in Stitches, Joined by the Cloth. Joining me today are Crystal Rollins Jackson from Boston, Massachusetts, Tarsha Nicole Taylor from Dracut, Massachusetts, and Kim Love Radcliffe from New London, Connecticut. This group recently came to our attention when one of our ASG members shared an article from the Boston Globe. This group loves expressing African American culture and traditions through a love of quilting. And the thing that most caught my attention when I read the article was how deeply storytelling is embedded into their craft and artistry of quilting. So I'm going to quote from their website where it says, "Over the centuries, we of African descent have joined together to make quilts as a way of sharing our joys, sorrows, traditions, and to celebrate our history. Quilting connects us to our ancestors, preserves our memories, and gives us a way to connect with generations to come." I loved that quote, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your organization and your creative storytelling through the fiber arts. So ladies, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd love for our audience to get to meet each one of you. So if each of you could introduce yourself briefly and tell us how long you've been part of the organization, the Sisters in Stitches, Joined by the Cloth. Tarsha, you want to start us out?
Sure. My name is Tarsha Nicole Taylor. I've been quilting for over 20 years, but I have been a member of Sisters in Stitches, Joined by the Cloth for a little over 3 years.
Awesome. We're glad you're here, Tarsha.
Thank you.
Crystal, you want to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Crystal Rollins Jackson, and I've been quilting since 1997 when the guild started. So I'm one of the co-founding members of the guild.
Awesome. And Kimberly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kimberly Love Radcliffe from New London, Connecticut. And I started in the guild in 2015, was there for a couple of years, popped out a minute, and now I'm back.
Wonderful. And I'm glad you're back in time to be with us today on this panel. So thanks to all three of you for joining me today. I always like to start these fireside chats hearing more about how people got started and how they made their journey to where they are today. Now, I understand that your organization formed back in 1997, so that's almost about 25 years ago. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you began and the sewing journey the group has been on since that first time of organization.
Well, Cheryl, we, as you said, we started in 1997, and I had the idea that I wanted to make a quilt, but I had no idea how to do that. And a friend of mine suggested that I take a class with Jackie Anderson Wilson, and I invited a friend who's now our president, Susie Ryan, and there's two other people that joined in this workshop. And so we just loved it, and we just kept going. And then we got invited to exhibit for the NAACP on Martha's Vineyard for their tea.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
We didn't really have enough quilts, and there just happened to be another group of African American women who were quilting in the greater Boston area. And so we invited them to participate with us. And so we joined together, and we called ourselves Sisters of the Cloth, and they called themselves Sisters in the Stitches. And so we joined the names together, Sisters in Stitches, Joined by the Cloth, and had our first exhibit on Martha's Vineyard.
Nice. So I guess, what is it, next year you'll be coming up on your 25th anniversary?
Yes, we were just talking about what we're going to do. Hopefully we'll do something special, maybe a symposium or a quilt show. Hopefully our circumstance of meeting virtually will change and we'll be able to do something in person.
Yes, I hope so too, because that's a special anniversary. And I hope you're able to celebrate big for an
Well,
anniversary like that.
it's hard to believe that it's been 25 years. When you're doing something that you love and you're passionate about, the time just flies.
It does. It's kind of like with kids, you say, where'd the time go? They were just babies. And I thought that we'd never get past that. And then suddenly they're going off to college or working or whatever, so, but that just says that you and your organization have really been enjoying your experience, because that's when time really flies.
Yes, definitely.
Well, I'm really intrigued by your strong commitment to storytelling. It has seemed to me that your primary goal is to tell stories of your history, and that you've chosen the craft of quilting as your medium. Many times, a quilt organization is about the quilting process first, and may or may not include any storytelling. But I love this idea of having a narrative. So, can one of you or a couple of you talk about the connection between the narrative aspect and the quilting aspect?
Well, I think that I'm always wanting to tell a story. That's just the way my mind works. And I come from a tradition, like my family. They were always telling stories, reading books, passing down information to me. And my first quilt was that it was telling a story about my family. And so it just seems like the fabric allows you to be able to manipulate it in such a way that that you can tell your story, as long as you don't have the the structure put in place in which you're limited as to what you can do. And so I think that's when we talk about what African American quilting is. It's really limitless, and there are rules, but there aren't those rules that confine you to imagining creating something out of fabric and telling your story.
Yeah.
For me, the quilting, the narrative is as equally important as the artwork or the quilt itself, because for me, quilting is like journaling. If it's on my mind, I have to make a quilt. So that's why the narrative is almost as equally as important as technique, because it's the act of remembering and telling the story and honoring ancestors and just sharing our history and culture.
That's very interesting. It's an interesting idea to think of quilting as journaling. I kind of like that thought process. I'm going to have to think about that some more. What about you, Tarsha? What about the narrative captures you?
Yes, for me, the story and the narrative is fairly new because I was more a traditional quilter. But the more time that I spent with the sisters, I'm actually doing more research on my own and learning how the traditional quilting and storytelling quilting are related, but yet they're different. So for me, it is something new.
That's very interesting. I love hearing about this connection. Well, I'm guessing that each one of you may have a favorite quilt, and maybe it's because of the aesthetics of the quilt, or maybe it's because of what the quilt represents. I would love for each of you to tell us about that favorite quilt and the story behind it, and maybe why you selected it as your favorite. So, Kim, would you like to start us off?
Sure. My favorite quilt is Bebop Jones. And Bebop, I made Bebop 2 years after my father passed away. And I set out with the intention of changing the energy around grief. I decided that it would no longer be that sad occasion. It would be a joyous occasion. And so I set out to make a composite quilt of my father and my great uncle, and capturing that male energy of protectors. And so it's my favorite quilt because it allowed me to transform that energy of being sad to something of, wow, not only does it capture the memory of my father and my uncle, but I also have something that I love, like all the fabrics and energy around the male influences in my life.
Oh, what a wonderful way to process. Grief's a hard thing to process, but what a wonderful approach to take. And it's a beautiful quilt. I'm so glad that you shared it with us so we could see it too.
Yeah.
Crystal, what about you? Do you have a favorite?
Well, my favorite is my first quilt, ancestral quilt, and it's a collection of photo transfers from my grandmother's photo album, and the pictures were fading, and she had the photo album since she was a teenager, and so it was really like chronicling her life. And so I wanted to preserve them, and I wanted to have a record of my grandmother's story. She had known my grandfather almost all her life, and so there were pictures of him when he was like in second grade, and just really great pictures from way back when. And so I wanted to put them on a quilt, for all to see and to honor her. And I also used paper mache to make a mold of my mother's face. And so that's in the center of the quilt. And so in honoring my mother, I'm honoring my grandmother and her mother before her and her mother before her, and so on and so on. And so that's so it's a record of my family, and I can pass that on to someone else, and after I'm gone, and hopefully they'll take care of it.
Okay. Paper mache is not a supply that I was expecting to hear about in talking about quilts. Tell me more about how you incorporated paper mache.
Well, my background is an illustrator, as well as, I took a lot of ceramics when I was in college, and I just love 3-dimensional things. So I put them on the quilt. The funniest part was getting my mother to put the mold on her face, and letting it dry and everything.
This is like this isn't like your interpretation. This is like truly a mold of face.
I did my mother and my grandmother and myself. So maybe one day I'll make a quilt with the 3 generations.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. You've blown me away with this paper mache aspect. That's just blowing me away. Very, very cool.
And at the time when I was making it, now it's very common for people to put photo transfers on fabric, but back then it was something that most people didn't know how to do. So I ended up in the process of teaching a lot of people how to transfer photos onto fabric.
Wow. So you're a trailblazer, starting organizations, learning photo transfer. Well, that is very, very interesting. So I'm so glad that you shared that one with us. Tarsha, how about you?
Sure. My favorite quilt is titled Butterscotch. One of the reasons why I like it is I remember as a child sitting in church, in order to keep quiet, my grandmother would keep giving us kids butterscotch candies. And I'm allergic to chocolate, so it's one of my favorite. And when I was trying to decide on making a quilt, I was at one of the local quilt shops, and they had a jelly roll titled Butterscotch. I'm like, oh, I have to get this. And then the other part of the quilt, more of the, I guess you'd call it the sashing, is almost like a butterscotch color. So that really, the two just had to go together. And my background is in engineering. So the quilt has a lot of different angles associated with it, where I could use, some math and just put my 2 favorite skills together. And that's how I came up with the butterscotch.
So your narrative is reflected in the colors in the butterscotch jelly roll more than necessarily like specific shapes. The shapes reflects your engineering background, but the story comes from those colors. Is that right?
Yes.
It's so interesting to hear the 3 of you talk and you're all three telling stories, but your approach is so diverse. And that makes it so interesting to hear about. I'm curious about some of the specific techniques that you sometimes use. I mean, you've already talked a little bit about that, but could you dive in a little more into some of the specific techniques that you use in telling the story through the quilts? Kim, do you want to start us off on this one?
Sure. For my quilt, Bebop Jones, I painted a face, and then I used thread, a technique called thread painting, to stitch over top to bring out the colors and the texture. And I also used scrappy fabrics to tell the story and put a colorful background that was improv piece for the background.
That sounds pretty. The thread painting sounds pretty labor intensive. Am I right in guessing that?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But the end result is worth the time. You know, quilters, we don't care about time. We have to put those elements in there to tell our story.
That's really interesting. How about you, Crystal? Can you talk about some techniques for us?
Well, I think my quilt entitled Fort to Fort View from Cape Coast is a good example of using multiple techniques. Of course, I hand quilted, but I also beaded an Adinkra symbol, which comes out of Ghana, and it has, there's usually a proverb behind it. And this one is about two crocodiles sharing the same stomach, which means that your destinies are together and you need to figure out a way to work out your differences.
I love that.
Yeah, so I was inspired by the beading that they do in Nigeria. And so that's why it's beaded, and I stuffed it from the back, like trapunto, so that it would be raised.
Interesting.
And so there's also hand beading on this piece, as well as like folding of the fabric to kind of make it look like there's waves in the water. And I use the cathedral window, which is a traditional quilt pattern, which isn't usually thought of as being quilting per se, because you don't usually have to put a backing on it. But it's a series of folds, and then you sew them down. But to me, it reminded me of wood, and so that's why I used like a non-cotton fabric to create the cathedral window.
Nice. Very nice. Well, and beading, some of the pictures that you've shared with me from others in your organization have had beading incorporated. So beading is apparently, I guess, one of the techniques that is frequently used to express parts of the story. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Different members use, different techniques. And one of our members, Sheila Lutz, is a master beater, embroider, and her art quilts are just filled with, various techniques. She loves buttons, and using buttons to represent and symbolize different things, as well as hoops. She uses all kinds of hoops and sews those in. And I think that has to do with, this life cycle is never ending.
Really interesting. Very, very interesting. Such interesting techniques tied to interesting fabric, or not fabrics, but supplies, elements of your quilts, and it just turns it so much more into art, which is so interesting. Tarsha, what about you? Any special techniques that you like to use?
A special technique is I like to use a variety of fabrics. One of my quilts is titled Family and Friends, and within that quilt, there's fabric that has the Adinkra symbol, Sankofa, and that fabric was actually printed by my sister when she spent some time in Ghana. So it was able to be incorporated into the quilt. And that particular piece the guild had a challenge was to use a piece of her fabric to match a challenge within the place that we meet of a certain, we had to represent everyday saints. And so for me, I chose family and friends as everyday saints, where I used embroidery because I'm more of a machine quilter than a hand quilter. So I use the technique of machine embroidery as well as using, hand printed fabric.
I love the aspect of the fabric was hand printed by your sister in, where'd you say, Ghana?
Yes.
Yeah, so in Ghana, and then that made its way to you, and then you've now incorporated into a quilt. So it carries a part of her story of her time there into this quilt that you've made.
Yes.
I can imagine your meetings must have all kinds of different quilts going on and stories being woven together in the fabric.
And one of the things that happens, I think, when we meet, which I think we're really missing because of this pandemic, is that, you try different techniques, and then sometimes you don't know how to resolve the place you've gotten yourself into, so you can bring your quilt to the group, and we'll all sit around and look at it and see if we can come up with some solution for where you've got yourself into. And I really do miss that.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are missing that kind of interaction. Those of us that are used to having those group think moments. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Crystal, that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask or talk to you guys about next is that's your creative process. So can you talk about how you each decide what you'll create, how you select your fabrics, or any other aspects of the creative process? Let's see. Let's go back to Tarsha. Would you start us off with that?
Sure. For me, once again, it's my background. I love color. I love design. And so when I'm thinking of a project, I'm thinking of the recipient or the intended use. Is this going to be for someone that I know that will really use it on a bed or as a wall piece, or is it most likely going to sit in a corner? So for me, I take all that into consideration. And with the design, I just like to take it to the next level. I'll see various quilts and say, oh, that's nice. How could I make that different? How can I make it more from me? Put a little Tarsha in it on each level. So that's kind of how my process goes.
Nice. How about you, Kim? What is your process like?
My process usually starts with the story, and I will allow that story that I intend to tell to guide. Like, I don't plan it and say I'm going to start here at A and end up at Z. I may have a color in mind, and I just allow that story to unfold. So I'm just as surprised as everyone else at the end.
Interesting. Do you have favorite techniques or favorite approaches when it comes to that?
I really aim to add texture to things. So I'm fond of adding an element of hand stitching, because that's like holding that baby on your lap and giving it that extra hug and love. So hand stitching is a part of it. Fabrics, I'm not opposed to using anything, like whether it's upholstery, paper, whatever. If it's going to help me tell that story, then it's all fair game. So it's very improvisational.
It sounds like it. And are the vast majority of your quilts intended to be a wall hanging as opposed to a lap quilt?
My first quilt was intended for the bed, but since then, everything else is intended to be art, to tell a story, to go on a wall. I since have made some string quilts and things like that to go, to use. But my main purpose is usually to tell the story, and so I can really knock those out faster. And the larger projects, the hand stitch stuff for the bed, those take a long time. So they're there. I do it all. I try to anyway.
Yeah, nice. How about you, Crystal? What's your process look like?
I think my inspiration comes from the story, and I'm really rooted in my ancestors and history. And so, though that inspires me, and in order to tell the story, that's how I pick the fabric. Sometimes the fabric picks me, and then I have to, I have to use it for something, and then it tells me the story, and so I just follow. So it goes both ways. Sometimes I feel like I'm in control, and then other times it just runs away with whatever it's going to be. And just like Kim said, sometimes the finished product is nothing of what I thought it was going to be, but it's what it was supposed to be. And so I also love texture as well, and using different techniques that aren't traditionally for quilting, like putting, a paper mache face on a quilt, or using a traditional quilt pattern in that's something that's not cotton. And so that's really how I'm inspired.
Well, I'm noticing behind you is either some beautiful fabric that is quilt-like in design, or a quilt. Is that a quilt?
It's not a quilt. It's actually batik from Ghana.
Oh, it is.
I spent a lot of time there, so and we love African fabric.
It's beautiful. I love it. I've been eyeing it ever since we've been on. So I'm going to guess that yours also is primarily wall art, as opposed to like for a lap quilt or bed quilt or something like that. Is that correct?
All mine are art quilts, except for I was inspired to make a quilt for my niece, and I actually finished it. So I was excited. They're twins, so I have to make another one.
Well, yes, absolutely. Got to do for one as the other, huh?
Yeah.
Nice. I've loved hearing about all of your creative processes. It's been fascinating. I'd like to shift our focus just a little bit now. We at the American Sewing Guild place a really high value on the relationship aspect of our sewing community. And I sense that your organization also places a high value on relationships. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how being a part of Sisters in Stitches has played a role in your friendships and your relationships, and maybe even what do you most attribute the relationship side of being a part of the organization to. So maybe Crystal, you could start us out with this one.
I really do feel like we're sisters, and the cloth does connect us. And we spend a lot of time together, talking, eating, like celebrating life. And so that's also represented in our quilting, what we create. One of the things that we have done since we started is go on retreats. And that's a really special time. And it's just more celebrating sisterhood, and the love of cloth, and the love of telling stories, and the love of just being together as sisters.
Nice. Very nice. Tarsha, what about you?
One of the things that I found that joining with sisters was I felt comfortable from day one. As soon as I walked into the room at my first meeting, it just felt welcoming. Everyone reached out. They got a little bit of background information about me, which really was, comforting. And then within that same year, I went out on the first retreat. And it was just so comfortable because we share things. We talk about current projects that we're working on. We talk about future projects and projects that we'll do as a team, whether it's to do charitable work or work on like our raffle quilts. So it's just really good to work together. And they are my sisters, and I refer to them as that. And everyone's like, oh, well, you have your sisters. I'm like, yeah, I have my blood sisters. And I also have my quilting sisters. And I'm fortunate that I have a blood sister who's also one of our sisters on the thing. So I get a double in that case.
Very nice. It's kind of a family, kind of a family thing for you and your sister.
Yes.
Nice. Kim, how about you?
From day one, like Tarsha said, I was welcomed into the fold. And, you know, I knew when I met these ladies that I had met lifelong friends. Sewing can be so isolating, but, you know, to have your sisters, you know, to do all of these fun projects with and to encourage and inspire you, it's been amazing. And I really appreciate all of them.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think that organizations like yours and like ours have really had to work hard to understand how to function in a pandemic environment, because we're so used to that face-to-face in real life, touching the projects, touching the fabric. You touch my fabric, I touch your fabric. I mean, it's just, there's just something about that in real life connection. And we've really had to learn some things. I understand from some previous chats that you've had to learn some online meeting techniques and being able to connect with each other virtually, just like we are doing today. And that's had its challenges, but it's also caused us to all grow a little bit in a new area. So, but I, for one, and it sounds like you all also will be really looking forward to when we can all get back in the same room together.
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I always like to close these chats asking about what's coming up next. Is there a new project or effort or a new thing that we should be watching for on the horizon for Sisters in Stitches Joined by the Cloth?
Well, we have our raffle quilt, which actually is on loan from the raffle winner at the Memorial Hall, Deerfield, Massachusetts Museum. It's an exhibit entitled Fabric of Time, New England History Told Through Domestic Art. And that will be up until the end of 2021. And hopefully the museum will open back up and you'll be able to go there in person. And you have to register. It's $5. You can go on their website and register. And we have a program coming up with the Transitions Network, which is a social group for women who are 50 and forward. And that will be on May 14th at 10 a.m. And
what kind of event is that? Is it an exhibit?
No, it's not. It's I guess we'll be actually. It's like a trunk show. We'll be showing our quilts and talking about them.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
So for details about any of the programs that I've mentioned or any more information about Sisters in Stitches, you can go to our website at www.sistersinstitches.org.
Well, those are some exciting things to look forward to. I will be looking forward to seeing whether it's another Boston Globe article or other kind of information that I can see about your ongoing storytelling through the fiber arts. Ladies, it has been an absolute delight to hear about your organization, to meet each one of you, to hear about your own personal stories and work. You have absolutely delighted me, and I'm sure our viewers, by telling us about your narrative quilting. So thank you so much for spending time with me today. I couldn't have enjoyed it anymore. So thank you, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.